Imagine an empire so huge that it had abruptly bolstered 3 vast continents. For more than 600 years, the world witnessed one of the greatest powers, known as the Ottoman Empire. With cities of ancient histories, including Constantinople, the fabled gateway between the continents, Cairo in the heart of Egypt, and even Mecca, one of Islam's holiest sites. Its rulers, sultans, commanded armies that struck fear across kingdoms, and its trade routes brought wealth and influence from the east to the west. In its heyday, with a fabled leader named Suleiman the Magnificent, the empire seemed momentarily unstoppable. Suleiman expanded its territory to new heights, creating a realm that stretched from Hungary in Europe down to the deserts of Arabia, covering an enormous portion of the known world. People marveled at its cities, its bustling markets, its stunning palaces, and its mosques, all designed with remarkable intricacy. But, like all great empires, the Ottoman Empire did not sustain that power indefinitely. As the world around it changed, cracks appeared, subtle at first, but deepening over time, signalling an inevitable decline in its structure. The fall of the Ottoman Empire is less about a single battle or a single moment, and more a tale of slow and painful decline, where each problem led to another, each weakening the empire further. It is a story of battles and uprisings, courageous reformers and mounting failures, of external enemies and internal strife. Over centuries, the once mighty Ottoman Empire gradually became a shadow of its former self. So, what brought this powerful empire down? How did the Ottomans go from dominating vast lands and ruling millions to a small, weakened state, struggling to survive? As we examine the forces that chipped away at the empire, both from within and from outside, you will understand how even the strongest powers can fall. This journey will lead us through tales of ambition and betrayal, of rulers who dreamed of restoring the empire's glory, and rivals eager to see it fall. So, come along on a journey through this remarkable story of how the once unbreakable and feared Ottoman Empire unraveled piece by piece, and how the echoes of its history continue to shape the world today. Yet, to be able to understand the fall of the Ottoman Empire, one has to go back as far as when the elements for its decline started to take root. Surprisingly enough, during what is considered the zenith of the empire under Suleiman the Magnificent in the 16th century, these signs began to emerge. Indeed, while the empire appeared strong, the fissures that had started to develop were there, but subtly beneath the surface. One of the first harbingers of succession problems was that the Ottoman rulers followed the policy of leaving the sons of the Sultan in fierce competition for the throne, whereas in the case of other monarchies, this right was given to the eldest son. Succession was often chaotic. Brothers fought against and killed brothers, weakening stability at leading positions that needed to be upheld. Those sons spent most of their lives isolated from the realities of governance. Subsequently, many of them did not have the experience of wisdom of how to rule well by the time they reached the throne. The economic foundations of the empire began to crack as well. In its heyday, the Ottomans had controlled the vital trade routes between Europe and Asia, bringing immense wealth into the treasury. By the 16th century, however, European maritime powers like Portugal and Spain found alternative sea routes to Asia, diverting traffic around the Ottoman-controlled overland routes. As a result, the empire's trade revenues started to shrink, along with growing financial pressures. The once legendary Janissary Corps, the empire's elite fighting force, also began to decay. Composed of Christian boys forcibly converted to Islam and rigorously trained in the good old days, the Janissaries were responsible to no one but the Sultan, and functioned as a well-disciplined standing army. Over many centuries, it grew increasingly corrupt and indolent. By the 17th century, most of the Janissaries had civilian jobs, shored the taint of political intrigues, preventing military reforms, and rebelling constantly against the Sultan. These were but the beginning of the problems. While the empire remained a formidable power, it was in these internal weaknesses where the seeds would be set for a long and painful decline. By the start of the 17th century, from within and outside its empire, serious turmoil began to strike the Ottoman Empire. The aura of invincibility had already begun to wear off, and the defeats the empire started to experience began to change the course of history. One of the initial severe setbacks happened in 1571, during the Battle of Lepanto, a frenzied naval battle in which a combined force from Spain, Venice and the Papal States overwhelmed the Ottoman fleet, a battle which stamped the finale to Ottoman supremacy in the Mediterranean. Although the Ottomans would rebuild their fleet in relatively short order, Lepanto showed the world, and the Ottomans themselves, that their ascendancy was indeed to be challenged. In reality, the actual turning point came more than 100 years later with the Siege of Vienna in 1683. For a long time, the Ottomans had desired Vienna as the crown jewel of the Habsburg Empire that would serve as their entrance into Central Europe. This time, however, the Ottoman advance fell to combined Austrian, Polish and other European forces that finally put a stop to further expansion into Europe. The defeat was worse than a setback. It marked the realization that the empire was no longer in its heyday of power. These losses underlined more profound issues of corruption in the administration and in the weakening of central authority. The provincial governors, known as beys or pashas, began ruling in a more autonomous fashion, collecting taxes, as always from non-Muslims, on behalf of themselves, rather than passing the funds on to Istanbul. Corruption and self-interest led to pervasive mismanagement, with officials who had little sense of loyalty to the Sultan. The military, once the backbone of Ottoman power, headed down a parallel path of decline. Indeed, the Janissaries, originally an elite corps of disciplined, kidnapped Christian boys, forcefully converted to Islam and trained as soldiers, became ever more complacent and politically influential. Resisting any form that threatened their privileges, they became a destabilizing rather than a protective force, and went so far as to remove sultans who reigned in their influence. In response to these problems, Sultan Ahmed I tried some reforms in government and military, starting around 1606. This was done to reduce corruption for a more disciplined military. However, the reforms he initiated were superficial and did not get to the roots of the problem. They met with fierce opposition from influential factions, including the provincial governors, who benefited from the status quo. Lacking the regular leadership and government backing, Ahmed's reforms would have little durability. By the 17th century, the name for the Ottomans was the sick man of Europe. While Europe entered an age of rapid modernization and scientific progress, the Ottoman Empire held fast to outmoded systems. The countries of Western Europe continued their developments in technology, military strategy, and economics, while the Ottomans fell further behind. While some leaders within the Ottoman Empire knew they had to modernize, these elements were resisted by more conservative forces that did not want to betray the Islamic identity of the empire. Military defeats and territorial losses reduced revenues of the empire as well. As European maritime powers had begun to circumvent Ottoman-controlled trade routes, income dwindled, and a financial squeeze was put on the empire. By the century's end, It was clear that things were not going very well with the Ottoman Empire. There had been a spate of military defeats, restless provinces, and opposition to reform. The sick man of Europe was locked into the vicious cycle of internal counter-change resistance and the opening of actual vulnerabilities that plunged the Ottoman Golden Age into an extended period of stagnation and decline. At the start of the 18th century, the Ottoman Empire stood at a significant crossroads. While Europe raced forward with new ideas, scientific advancements, and military innovations, the Ottomans appeared to be standing still, burdened by tradition and internal challenges. Yet, during this tense period, a brief but remarkable era of cultural flourishing began, the Tulip era. This period took its name from the tulips that adorned extravagant gardens across Istanbul during Sultan Ahmed III's reign from 1703 to 1730. Imagine Istanbul each spring, a bustling city filled with vibrant, colourful tulips everywhere. These flowers, with their rich hues and delicate shapes, became symbols of status and luxury. The Ottoman elite competed to cultivate the most stunning gardens, hosting extravagant parties to display their wealth. Once modest garden flowers, tulips had become a central part of the empire's identity, representing elegance and sophistication. During this time, the Sultan and his court grew captivated by the culture and trends streaming in from Europe. New architectural styles, influenced by European tastes, appeared in palaces and mansions. Western art, fashion, and even music found favour among the upper classes, and the first printing presses arrived, introducing new ways of sharing information and ideas. Initially limited to non-Muslim communities, the printing press offers the potential for broader cultural exchange. But beneath the dazzling surface, the empire's core problems remained unsolved. The Tulip era was largely confined to the elite, who enjoyed luxuries and indulgences, while the wider population continued to face economic difficulties. The empire's military and administrative foundations were still weakening, and the powerful Janissary corps, once an elite force, growing complacent and resistant to change as corruption spread through the ranks. By the end of the century, it was clear that the empire needed deeper transformation. Sultan Selim III came to power with a bold plan for real reform, a modern army inspired by European military techniques, organised as a professional fighting force. This new army, called the Nizam-i-Jadid, or New Order, was trained and equipped in European style, with Selim hoping to restore Ottoman military strength. Aware of the risks, Selim believed it was the only way forward. However, the Janissaries, the traditional protectors of the empire, felt threatened by the New Order. As Selim's new army took shape, they feared their power and privileges slipping away. The idea of modernization met fierce resistance from conservative elements within the empire. Eventually, tensions boiled over. In 1807, the Janissaries rebelled, demanding that Selim abandon his reforms and disband the New Order. Facing intense opposition, Selim conceded, dismantling the New Order, only to be overthrown and assassinated soon after by forces loyal to the Janissaries. Selim's vision of a renewed, modern Ottoman Empire remained unfulfilled, his tragic end highlighting the difficulty of meaningful change. The Tulip era and Selim's reforms reflect both the empire's potential and its limits. While the Ottomans demonstrated they could adopt beauty, art, and foreign ideas, resistance to fundamental change remained strong. The Tulip era ended with the realization that simply embracing European influences was not enough. True reform would be a slow and costly process. This brief chapter in Ottoman history offers a glimpse of an empire at odds with itself, striving to modernize, yet holding tightly to tradition. The Ottomans, faced with the desperate need for change, instituted the Tanzimat reforms in the 19th century as an assortment of sweeping changes to revitalise the ailing empire. Derived from modernisation programmes between 1839 and 1876, under the leadership of Sultans Mahmud II and Abdul Mesid I, the reforms attempted to bring about a more central administration of the state, standardisation of laws, and modernisation of the military, education and economy. Perhaps the most dramatic of these steps was the way Mahmud II dissolved the Janissary Corps in 1826, bringing to an end what had for so long been hailed as the pride of the empire. Over time, the Janissaries had grown far too powerful and corrupted, standing seriously in the way of modernisation. By putting them out and installing a new, modern army in their place, the sultans were finally able to institute other reforms, free of interference by the old guard. These reforms in Tanzimat included giving all subjects civil rights and equality, regardless of their religion or ethnic background, in the hope of gaining loyalty from the various populations in the empire. It standardized taxes, modernized the legal system, and updated infrastructure to unify the empire. In spite of these efforts, the empire continued to decline. After over 500 years of Ottoman subjugation, the subjects of the Ottoman Empire began to think of themselves more as Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians, and so on. In a word, as different nations with the right of self-government. This was encouraged by the European powers, anxious to see the Ottoman Empire weakened, and thus further weakened the empire. The Tanzimat reforms represented the last major attempt of the empire to change its lot. Yet nationalism, European interference, and internal division continued to chisel away at the empire's foundation, pulling it apart. During the 19th century, the Ottoman Empire had grown threats from all sides, both abroad and within. This was the time when, in 1876, Sultan Abdul Hamid II appeared on the throne. The empire was involved in a desperate struggle for survival. Indeed, Abdul Hamid tried to consolidate his control by authoritarian rule, since this strong hand could hold the empire together only in such turbulent times. He promptly began suspending the brief, short-lived Ottoman constitution that was put forward during the era of the Tanzimat. He was of the view that any kind of shared governance would mean only disorder, whereas what he actually needed was a strong central control. Abdul Hamid was a stern ruler, with widespread networks of informers and spies to keep him informed about possible dissenters, and suppressed even slight signs of opposition by means of strict censorship and imprisonment. While this created a sense of stability in the short term, it considerably stifled political discourse and alienated many of his subjects. In an attempt to unify the empire, Abdul Hamid fell heavily on pan-Islamism, a doctrine that propagated the unity of all Muslims in the empire, especially under Ottoman rule. This was partly a reaction to rising nationalism among the Christian subjects in the Balkans, who had started seeking independence. However, pan-Islamism had limited success in that it did little to address the grievances of non-Muslim subjects or those who sought a more local autonomy. Meanwhile, European powers watched closely, waiting to pounce on every sign of weakness within the empire. Harsh policies pursued by Abdul Hamid, particularly those directed against minority ethnic groups like the Armenians, attracted international condemnation and allowed a pretext for European intervention as well. By the end of the 19th century, a series of violent clashes between Armenian nationalists and Ottoman forces would result in what today is referred to as the Hamidian massacres. Details and causes of such massacres are widely debated. However, the majority of them brought additional disrepute to the Ottoman Empire in the light of the international arena and increased the demands for reform. Adding to these were the increasing financial drains on the empire, with its growing dependence on Europe for its finances. The Ottomans had run up heavy debts for all manners of reforms and military campaigns, and towards the end of the 19th century, it found itself unable to pay back those loans. It was at this point when European banks took control over Ottoman finances, making the empire a certain economic dependent of Europe. Massive foreign control of its economy, combined with the widespread discontent of its citizens, gradually left the Ottoman Empire on increasingly shaky ground. By the turn of the 20th century, what was left of the Ottoman Empire was but a far cry from the glories of what it once was. From being the ruler of wide expanses of land to the ruler of key trade routes, by this time the empire could let out a merest comparison to a fragile relic that struggled under the load of corruption, internal divisions, and foreign debts. There was frustration and discontent that overflowed. The restive population included a new generation of reformers, self-named the Young Turks. In essence, the Young Turks were a dedicated group of nationalists, dreamers, and reformist intellectuals who envisaged their objective as nothing less than dragging the Ottoman Empire into the modern era and giving it a new lease of life. They looked around at European powers that were stronger, wealthier, and more dramatic, and they wanted it for their homeland too. They believed that if they could modernize the empire, turn it into a state ruled by laws and a constitution, rather than the whims of a sultan, they could save it from collapse. Of these reformers, the Committee of Union and Progress came to the forefront, believing in secular government, where the power of the sultan would be checked, and the voices of the people would matter. It wasn't until 1908 that the moment of truth finally arrived. The Young Turks, tired of Sultan Abdul Hamid II's autocratic regime, finally decided to make their move. It was a combination of political manoeuvring and popular support, forcing Abdul Hamid to reinstate his constitution, suspended all those many years ago, and revive the possibility of an Ottoman state that was far more democratic. This was the Young Turk Revolution, and it truly formed a turning point. Suddenly, an air of possibility was in the air. The mending of an Ottoman Empire, and perhaps its rejuvenation to former strength. It was not, however, an easy path. A year or two following the revolution, Abdul Hamid had been overthrown, and the CUP was the most common political force in the empire. The onus now lay on the Young Turks to convince themselves and others that they could dream big but lead effectively. They spared no time in reinstituting reform within the state, on modernizing the military, restructuring education, and building better infrastructure. They sought an Ottoman Empire prepared to respond to the challenges of the new century. Despite these, the original Young Turks faced almost insurmountable obstacles from the get-go. The Ottoman Empire stood on very unstable ground, weakened decade after decade through military defeat, economic strain, and political corruption. Nationalistic movements were on the rise too, especially in the Balkans, where self-consciously assertive Greeks, Serbs, Bulgarians, and others were demanding independence. This was like an internal time bomb, which the Young Turks found very difficult to handle. Then came the outbreak of the Balkan Wars in 1912 and 1913. the vicious wars saw the empire lose nearly all its European territories. It was a blow physically and symbolically. For several centuries, the Ottomans had been a European power, with lands deeply penetrating into the continent. Now, they had been tossed almost completely from Europe, holding on to little more than a slice of land around Istanbul. This was an elbow to the gut in light of the fact that the empire, against the energy and optimism of the Young Turks, was shrinking in power and influence. Even within the ranks of the CUP, unity was superficial at best. The Young Turks came into this coalition of high hopes, yet they were by no means united on what that future might be. There were several factions within the CUP with their own competing visions for the state. Some aimed at a more democratic and secular state, while others preferred an authoritarian one which might impose order. The internal divisions weakened them, and instead of focusing on the massive challenges they faced, often the CUP was caught up in intra-faction squabbles. To make matters worse, many of their attempted reforms ran up against centuries-old tradition and resistance by powerful groups who did not want to see change. The Ottoman bureaucracy was riddled with corruption, along with a military force that was neither modernized nor disciplined compared to other European armies. With every step taken forward, they reached a roadblock, and the dream of revitalizing the empire began to be further out of grasp. Indeed, by the outbreak of the First World War in 1914, it was holding from just a thread. Confronted with shrinking territories, fragile economy hitched to foreign loans, and deeply divided based on ethnicity, religion and loyalty, for the first time in its history, the Ottoman Empire was more fragile than ever. The attempt of the Young Turks to give fresh life to the Ottoman Empire was just an attempt to go up against the odds. The only desperate way to recapture some of the strength of the Ottoman Empire was to join this war on the side of the Central Powers, that is, the alliance with Germany and Austro-Hungary, in hope that a victory might restore some of its lost power and territory. This decision would only deepen the empire's troubles by dragging it into one of the bloodiest conflicts in history at the time, and hastening its decline. The best efforts of the Young Turks could do little to save the empire now, as it were, on a one-way course to its collapse, its foundations too frail to stand counter to the turmoil of the 20th century. Immediately upon the outbreak of the hostilities in World War I in 1914, the Ottoman Empire saw an opportunity to restore its former prowess by declaring entry into the war. Thus, the Ottomans entered the war on the side of the Central Powers, that included, amongst others, Germany and Austria-Hungary, hoping their victory might facilitate recovery of lost territories and some of its former glories. In fact, the entry into the war proved to be disastrous. The empire was woefully unprepared for long-term war fighting, and soon became mired on multiple fronts. One of the most well-known contests was the Gallipoli campaign, where Ottoman troops successfully repelled the Allied invasion. This triumph proved a cause of pride and created a buzz of Turkish nationalism. But it was one of the few high points in an otherwise draining and expensive war. The other involvement of the empire in World War I was the Arab Revolt of 1916. In it, the Arab leaders, aided by the British, came up against the Ottoman rule with the hope of becoming independent. This revolt came as a real blow to the control of the empire in the Middle East, as two major cities, Damascus and Baghdad, were taken over by the Arab fighters. By the end of the war, the Ottoman Empire was just about to completely break down. The 1920 Treaty of Sevres officially soothed the war for the Ottomans, but the terms in the treaty were simply very humiliating. The treaty took most of the remaining territories of the empire, leaving just a small area around Istanbul and Anatolia as possessions of the Ottoman Empire. As such, these degrading terms finally dissolved the empire into a morsel of what it had used to be. Their post-war years were characterized by general discontent and resistance among the citizens of the Ottoman Empire, particularly in Anatolia, from whence a new leader would arise to lead the final chapter in the Ottoman Empire's story. As the Ottoman Empire entered its final centuries, pressure from a powerful northern rival, Russia, weighed heavily. Throughout much of the 18th and 19th centuries, Russia was one of the main forces quickening the pace at which the empire would decline. Throwing off its own ambitions for expansion, Russia did whatever it could to weaken the Ottomans and take hold of strategic territories. Russian interference, often cloaked as protection of Orthodox Christians in the empire, was a terribly destabilizing influence on the Ottoman rule, reinforcing reforms that further laid its vulnerabilities bare. One of the main tasks facing Russia was access to the warm waters ports of the Black Sea and the Mediterranean. That ambition bred a series of wars with the Ottoman Empire as Russia sought naval superiority and opened up trade lanes that would facilitate its power projection into the Mediterranean area. When the Ottoman military started to weaken, Russia seized the chance to extend its influence, not infrequently acting in concert with other European powers to further squeeze the Ottomans out of Europe. A good example of how the Russian influence affected the Ottoman Empire was the case of the Balkan Wars of the early 20th century. Encouraged by Russia, the nationalist movements in the Balkans favoured the independence movements of the Christian populaces in the region. These movements eventually reached their aim of disintegrating the Ottoman control over most of its European territories as Balkan provinces joined the independence lot or became allied with Russia. These Russian-backed nationalists played the main role in turning the Balkans into a field of constant battle, where every now and then some new uprising against the Ottomans took place and some piece of land was torn from them. During the 19th century, European powers' intervention into the Ottoman Empire became more active, with the ambitions of Russia serving as a pretext. The real watershed came with the Congress of Berlin in 1878, where the victory of Russia over the Ottomans in the Russo-Turkish War was clumsily contained by intervention on the part of Europe. The Ottomans, under European mediation, did regain some of the territories that were lost, but the Congress marked a severe weakening of the power of the Ottomans in the Balkans and increased still further the control of Europe over the empire's future. Under Russian, as well as other European powers' pressure, the Ottoman Empire was compelled to make a plethora of reforms in modernizing administration, military, and infrastructure. This reform movement is known as the Tanzimat and is supposed to be a time of centralization and laying the basis for the effective government. Most often than not, however, it did otherwise. The empire was torn between adopting westernized systems and preserving its Islamic traditions. Permanent meddling from Russia, however, added to pressure by Britain and France, only intensified this internal struggle, with the ultimate effect of weakening cohesion within the Ottoman state. Russia's role in the empire's decline was marked by a mixture of direct military confrontations, strategic alliances, and manipulation of the Ottoman Empire's internal divisions. With Russia's expansion of influence over the Orthodox Christians in the Ottoman lands, the sultans could no longer ignore the reality that the days of uncontested Ottoman control over the region were well and truly over. By the early 20th century, Russia had kept up the pressure to such a degree that the Ottoman Empire was significantly weakened, and set up for its eventual collapse and the emergence of a new Turkish republic. The defeat in World War I had torn the Ottoman Empire apart, and amidst the chaos this defeat brought, a man was to arise, Mustafa Kemal, later to be famously known as Ataturk, or Father of the Turks. The Treaty of Sèvres had divested the empire of virtually all its territorial possessions, leaving much of Anatolia under foreign occupation, a humiliating blow given what had once been a great empire. Viewing this as threatening the very existence of his country, Mustafa Kemal marshalled Turkish nationalists against the control of foreign powers. In 1919, he initiated the Turkish War of Independence, joining both men and women from all over Anatolia in a battle for independence. His forces, against all odds, were able to force out the foreign armies by 1922. That year, the Ottoman Sultanate that had existed for more than 6 centuries was legally discarded. In 1923, he founded the Republic of Turkey as a secular modern state and became its first president. He introduced extensive reforms in his attempt to break with the Ottoman past. The government was to be secularized, Western laws adopted, and education modernized. Traditional Ottoman garb made way for Western-style apparel, and the Arabic script gave place to a Latin-like Turkish alphabet aimed at fostering literacy. The vision of Ataturk was clear enough: to mould one-minded Turkish souls obsessed with civilization, progress and modernization without any claims or desires to the empire. The Ottoman Empire was truly gone, but its legacy extended far into the Middle East, where boundaries drawn at the end of the First World War continued to shape contemporary nations. Yet, for Turkey, the reforms of Ataturk set the framework for a future of independence, resilience, and national pride. One single event, or any one leader, was not the cause of the fall of the Ottoman Empire. Rather, it was a very complicated process influenced by multiple forces at work, such as internal divisions, external pressures, economic struggles, and finally, rising nationalism. The growing challenges in the empire had to be endured for many centuries, with repeated attempts at reform and modernization, which proved insurmountable. The so-called legacy of the Ottoman Empire remains alive in the modern Middle East and modern-day Turkey. Its influence can still be felt from politics to culture to national identity. In its fall, the empire had retained a vital lesson: the so-called fragility of power, and that adaptability is highly essential if the world changes. This is how such a powerful empire, once at the pinnacle of strength and influence, came onto its knees. Travel further back in time and discover in the next installment of this series the turning points, the mythical triumphs, the great challenges that defined the Ottoman Empire. So much more awaits one on this fantastic voyage through the times.